for those of you that don't know me, although most of you saw me yesterday, I'm Scott McMahon. I'm one of the lobbyists with the coalition, but also run the Greater Minnesota Partnership. And I'm excited for our next couple of segments that we have here that are really going to focus in on the economy in Greater Minnesota, workforce issues, how do we support our businesses, how do we get our businesses to support the work that we're doing at the local community level. So I'm excited to kick this off with our first speaker, Rick Bauerly. And I'm always pleased when speakers send me a bio that I can read rather than trying to figure out what I need to say about people. So bear with me here for a moment. So Rick was raised in rural Benton County on a farm his father was raised on. He worked in high school and college at Bauerly Companies, the road construction company that his parents and uncle started. He attended St. John's University, the proud alma mater of myself, and majored in economics and management, graduating with honors. After college, Rick worked for Deloitte Consulting in Minneapolis as a business analyst advising large companies on their strategic, operational, and financial opportunities. He was admitted to the Harvard Business School, where he earned a master's in business administration. While in Boston, he earned a joint master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School, advancing his interest in community development. As his parents started planning toward retirement, they asked Rick to return to Bauerly Companies after graduate school to help manage the business and plan for its future. In time of public company, MDU Resources made an unsolicited offer to acquire the business, and Rick assisted his father in the evaluation sale process. Following the sale of the company, Rick began working toward establishing Granite Partners as a local and long-term alternative for business ownership successions. He and Helga took their savings, mortgaged their home, and seeded Granite. Along with partners, he recruited 12 central Minnesota families that would co-invest. Now, 20 years later, Granite Partners has acquired 10 great Minnesota-based companies, the vast majority of them located in Greater Minnesota, as their owners were moving into retirement. In his community engagements, Rick is currently a board member of the Initiative Foundation, the MIF located in Little Falls, the Minnesota Chamber Foundation, and the Anderson Center. He was a founding investor and incorporator of the Greater St. Cloud Development Corporation. Earlier in his community work, Rick served on the boards of CentraCare, Health, and St. John's University Private Investment Fund. Rick and Helga live in St. Cloud. Their passions include their daughters, Emily and Olivia, the Minnesota outdoors, tennis and triathlons, and trying to contribute to Minnesota development. What wasn't included in there, and what I am most excited about with Rick, and I'll hear more about this in a bit, is the belief in the values that they have within Granite Partners about businesses, especially how do we keep these anchor family businesses committed to Minnesota. And so you'll hear a great tale about success in keeping our businesses not only located in Greater Minnesota, but owned in Greater Minnesota and committed to Greater Minnesota. So with this, Rick, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Scott. Doing a little mic check here, and wonder if you can hear me down in the alley there. Yeah, we got some thumbs up. So, Scott, thank you for our conversations in the last few years and the work of the Greater Minnesota Partnership. We appreciate it and are happy to be members. You know, my goal today is that I hope I share one thing, one even small thing that might be helpful to you personally in your roles in cities and economic development, in chambers, in businesses and utilities. And I hope it's also helpful for us in some small way as collective fans in Greater Minnesota. Here's some topics that I thought I'd talk through, and I'm going to start with some background on the history of kind of the origin and the purpose of Granite Partners, and then segue into some principles that they come right out of the microeconomics course at St. John's University, but I've been thinking about them as we've struggled through the trials and tribulations of growing Granite Partners and growing the Granite company. So I'll share some of our experiences as it relates to these four basic economic principles. Ultimately, though, I want to parlay them into what risks they imply for us in the long-term prosperity in Greater Minnesota, But hopefully on a positive note, how can we take these risks, try to manage and mitigate them, and even turn them into opportunities? And as I talked with Scott about what, a topic I might reflect on, one of the areas that the Greater Minnesota Partnership and many of you in cities are working on, I thought I'd talk about the child care question. And I do want to acknowledge that I'm an amateur. I'm ignorant in some ways on child care, but I do believe that employers should care. And I do believe employers have a role that they can play in a greater way than we are today. So, and then if there's any time, we'll finish up with any Q&A. So, first up, just some origin story on Granite. In the years before we got Granite started, a series of great family businesses in and around St. Cloud in the central Minnesota region had been sold to remote owners. Some of these businesses you may be familiar with: Birchie Millwork in 1988, then Banker Systems and Woodcraft, Herberger's, Como, and Bauerly companies in 2001. And the sale of these businesses to big public companies and or buy to sell private equity funds created concern in our region amongst business owners. We developed a common concern. We developed a common enemy: remote absentee ownership. And this is what we think about as the experience of losing those 6 family companies, and really quite a number more in our region. We go from the left, local ownership, private ownership, with a long-term perspective on the business, a broad stakeholder orientation that cares about certainly customers, but also employees, suppliers, and the community. There's an ethic around being an owner, a responsible owner, and the leaders of the business are often civic and community leaders. And we move to the right as those businesses are sold. And the ownership becomes remote. It's often public ownership. And public ownership means millions of owners, often around the world. The perspective, the lens, becomes more short-term around quarterly earnings, and there's a narrower focus on the stockholder alone rather than broader stakeholders. It's an investment to be bought and sold. It's a stock to be bought and sold. And the executives and the community giving and beyond tends to move out of state. So for me, for our family, the sale of Bauerly companies, it was a tipping point, and it was a transition. We were redeploying capital, and other families who shared this goal of creating a better way, a local long-term vehicle for ownership, joined. We recruited them to invest capital into Granite Partners. These are 12 of what we call the founding families in Granite Partners. Again, they're families in central Minnesota. There are families like this in all of our communities who have been community leaders and business leaders. The Alexanders built the Cold Spring Granite Company over 5 generations. The Andersons built Anderson Trucking Service over 60 years. Bauerly companies have been building for 40 years. All 12 had built family businesses and had been in business across generations, and collectively, we added it up. We have 750 years of experience in this group of families in business. Beyond the families who have contributed the vast majority of our capital for growth, we reached out in 2007 to the Initiative Foundation in our home region, and they decided to make an endowment investment in our Granite Fund to help retain ownership in businesses. They were the first of the Minnesota Initiative Foundations to invest. I'm happy to share that all 6 of the Minnesota Initiative Foundations are and have been invested with us now for many years. Following that, the Blanding Foundation, the Northwest Area Foundation, the Bush Foundation, Centricare, Community Giving, and others have invested. Foundations have a perpetual view on the community. They're investing in the long run for community and economic development, and thus are aligned with our long-term perspective. This today is our ownership. 12 families, along with myself and our executive team, own 50% and provided 50% of the capital investment. On top, the 13 strategic foundations have contributed about 10% of our capital. In the middle, it's very important. We have 275, mostly business executives, but also professionals all around greater Minnesota and the Twin Cities, such that together there are 300 members in our funds, 300 long-term owners in our mission. And there is strength in those numbers, but there's also strength that comes from high retention, high long-term ownership. We have collectively retained capital, kept the capital invested at a 99% retention rate. So thinking very long-term about the ownership in our company. But that's how we capitalize. The more important thing is next. Over the last 20 years then, we've been focused on providing a home, a long-term home, for other great family businesses who are planning for the succession of their owners. And you know in your regions there's often an owner who's built it across a generation, sometimes 2 or 3, and we humans, we do need to retire. We do need to plan for our succession and transition and continuity, and we are an ownership and succession planning service, and we can bring the capital then to purchase the stock in a great company so that owners can realize a return on their investment across decades. So these 10 companies, I hope one of them is close to you. You might know it by name, all with greater Minnesota roots. They tend to be 20, 30, 40 years old. We don't invest in startups. It's a different sport. It's a different investment profile. We don't invest in turnarounds either, and sometimes businesses are in distress and they need capital. We don't invest in that case. We invest in great companies that are established, profitable, and growing, and would not be for sale for any other reason than human life cycles and succession planning. And in fact, most founders, most entrepreneurs and business owners, it's the last thing they want to do is sell this great company. But we help with that emotional process of letting go to a responsible owner who can help carry the legacy forward. As a group of companies, we generate about $800 million in revenue, so we've achieved a significant scale, and the companies have grown, on average, 17% a year across those 20 years. So we achieve high growth even in some relatively boring products and industries. The companies, while rooted in Minnesota, have national and ideally global markets. So we're selling to the world. We are sourcing inside and outside of Minnesota as well. And in some ways then we are importing economic activity to Minnesota. In addition to investing in companies in Minnesota, we help those 10 companies buy other companies that are complementary in their products, their technologies, their markets. And so we have added on 20 companies to these 10 companies. Those add-on acquisitions are often outside of Minnesota, across an industry, and even around the world. So it's part of our formula for growth. Final thought on Granite, 2 final thoughts before we segue. So in terms of our Minnesota presence and impact, as I mentioned, here it says 90% of our members or owners are in Minnesota. The accurate number is probably 99%. So we are Minnesota owners. If you come down to that, we tend to look for investments in community organizations or charitable investments in Minnesota as well. And I'll share a word about that, but we have collectively, the 300 of us, donated $30 million, largely in stock, largely in Granite's stock, for the benefit of Minnesota-based charitable organizations. We, of course, pay taxes in the state, significantly in Minnesota and local cities and counties. Our 200 executives and board members are largely in and living in Minnesota, and about 2/3 of our team members, 2,500 team members across the companies, are in Minnesota. Supply chains are in Minnesota and around the world. The customers are the one stakeholder group that really aren't Minnesota. They really are outside of Minnesota in the rest of the United States, and they're around the world. Our customers are businesses, and they are governments in our business-to-business model. So we're selling outside of Minnesota from energy that comes from within Minnesota. So we state our purpose, really our objective, as sustaining for 100 years. Not maximizing profit, not being the biggest, but really sustaining what we're doing for impact. Our mission is to grow companies. Our vision is to contribute to community prosperity, and our values really focus on being trusted partners and innovative leaders and responsible stewards. Well, after raw bragging for 5 minutes, I'm going to move on to so what? So why does this matter to us as we think more broadly? I want to talk about these 4 economic principles that they'll make sense to you, and I'll share a little bit about our experience learning from these principles, leveraging them, and understanding them. I'm going to start with scale. This is the first principle, that the scale of what we do matters, and that being thoughtful about scale matters. And in this cute little diagram, it's thinking south to north. It's growing what we do. More specifically, I'll talk about economies of scale. And in this economic principle of economies of scale, unit costs, the cost to produce a widget, the cost to care for a child, unit costs decline with increasing volume. It's almost a universal truth, and if we don't pay attention to that, it can set us back. And so, underneath the principle that unit costs decline with volume is really the deeper principle that experience matters, that learning matters, whether we are producing a widget or whether we are providing a service or creating software. In our experience on economies of scale, we can see our costs come down with volume. It happens within the companies as we study them. It happens as an aggregate portfolio. So our experience bears out this theory that economies of scale matter. The second principle is about scope. I think of this as east to west or left to right, or the breadth of what we're doing. Defining deliberately the breadth of what we're going to do. In this economic principle of economies of scope, we illustrate here that certain volumes of widgets or serving people, they can be aggregated, they can be consolidated across, in our case, across companies. But I'll try to share later that they might be aggregatable across other units of government or foundations or beyond. So we illustrate here in our case that we aggregate company A, B, C, D, and we think about their volume collectively in some ways. The next slide shares some of the ways we think about this. We call our cross-company teams to aggregate things affinities. When there is affinity across 2 companies or 2 cities or 2 foundations to do something together, when it makes sense to do something together, we create a team to do that. We have 12 teams doing that across the last decade, across the 10 companies. I'll share just one example. Our purchasing affinity aggregates purchasing, not in everything, because it's important that companies do their own purchasing in some things. But where it makes sense to aggregate purchasing, we do that. And we find 10 or 15% savings on industrial supplies and materials when we aggregate that volume for volume discounts. We can find 30% savings on some other services. When buying software, which is becoming an increasing purchasing matter for all of us, we get 50 or 60% volume discounts. So aggregation, collaboration across scope matters. Third dimension, we call sustainability. If we thought about scale as going south to north and scope going east to west, sustainability is moving in a third dimension over time, surviving, in our case, the global marketplace, living a long life as an organization, not going out of business. And so we try to keep this in mind, especially in business, because so many businesses fail. And here, I try to keep this concept of creative destruction in mind. And there's an economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who defined this some decades ago, but like in human biology, industrial mutation occurs and companies continuously adapt. And really, the marketplace destroys some companies who don't innovate fast enough, and others emerge. New business models emerge. And so sustainability is really what's on top of our mind. And we've defined 12 innovations and adaptations in our model that makes us different from other ownership models. And we think that innovation is what's helping us to date to sustain. I'm not going to go through all 12 of them, but I will share one example. In most private equity funds, the fund life is 10 years, and the funds buy companies and then they sell them for a return on investment. In our structure, we are a perpetual entity. We're what's called an evergreen fund. We buy companies to hold them and grow them forever. That's one of our innovations. And so we have survived for 20 years in our workspace. And the first 20 years are the most risky. And so we pause and are grateful for that. But we know when you look at it, only 1% of businesses survive to 100 years. And that's our objective, is to survive for 100 years. So we stay earnest and stay focused on reducing risk and ensuring innovation and sustainability. We have going for us that 10 owners of great businesses entrusted their business to us. They're 20 and 30 and 40 years old. They have survived in their respective industry niches, and they are niche leaders, each of them. Finally, and thank you for enduring this thinking of this academic thinking about economics. The fourth dimension, or the fourth principle, you could have an organization that's operating at high scale. You could have an organization that has the right and a broad and effective scope. It could have sustained for 20 years already, but it might be losing steam, losing energy, losing momentum, losing velocity. And so we try to think about speed. What is the right speed? And are we moving fast enough? And on the next slide, this seems trivial, but information matters to speed. Imperfect information, really weak information, leads to imperfect and really weak decisions. And the better your information set, the better your business intelligence, the better your market intelligence, the better your analytics and metrics on any product or any business, the more likely we are to be able to decide fast, move fast, innovate faster, in our case, than competitors. And so we make significant investments in digital technologies and analytics platforms to create the right information for all 2,500 team members to make decisions rapidly, to innovate, to serve customers, to move with velocity. So this velocity scale, we think, is linked to the rapid proliferation of technology, really for all of our organizations. So here's the summary. An efficient and effective marketplace for widgets or for childcare. An efficient and effective marketplace operates at enough scale with the right amount of scope, often aggregated scope, with innovation to sustain, and with enough information, good information, to move with velocity over time. Okay, chapter 3. So what about Greater Minnesota? What do these 4 principles matter to us in Greater Minnesota? Well, let's start with economies of scale. I'm just going to ask this question: is it harder to achieve high volumes and thus low unit costs where population is less dense, where supply chains are thinner? Next question. Economies of scope. Is it harder to achieve aggregation and collaboration when there's greater geographic separation amongst people and amongst organizations? Next question. Is it harder to achieve scalable innovation, sustainable innovation when you have lower scale, lower scope, lower cash investments in widgets or in childcare? Next slide. Is it harder to get perfect information, good information, accurate information, and timely information about a widget or a company or a service in rural markets? I'm afraid the answer is yes to all 4. And so while we have risks in the short run, we have inflation, we have supply chain disruption, we have COVID, we have a lot of risks in the short run that we're all navigating. In the long run, we have risks that it's harder to operate at scale and with scope to sustain and to move with velocity, just given our geography and our demographics. But I'm an optimist, and many of you in here are optimists coming together to collaborate for what might be better through our collaboration. And so even if we take these risks and we understand them, name them, accept them, and try to mitigate them, try to parlay them into opportunities, what could we do together? What are we doing together? I thought I'd take the child care question and inquiry as one of the many areas that you all work on together. And in part, I took this one because it's personal. It's personal to all of us, whether we're parents or grandparents, aunts or uncles. So for me, this is Olivia and Emily. They're now adults. But they had an experience, and Helga and I had an experience with them and their child care in ways that all of us have. We had the fortune of the Sugar Plum Daycare Center in St. Cloud. It was a phenomenal experience. It was a single facility led by a phenomenal woman, a hero. And she provided exceptional safety and security and health and nurturing and a wonderful environment for our children in their early years. Shirley didn't operate at scale or with scope. Sugar Plum still exists, but it's probably not sustainable across decades. As phenomenal as it was. They then went to Montessori school. Montessori has a unique model. It includes some more educational content in preparation for kindergarten, and they were fortunate, we were fortunate to experience Montessori. Montessori is operating at more scale with broader scope, more sustainability across decades, and they have good information to continue to optimize. That's some of the personal experience Helga and I think about in looking back on child care. Now, I'm an amateur And I do not know what many of you know about the child care market and service in Greater Minnesota. So I start with thanks for your work on this topic. I know it's a focus area of the Greater Minnesota Partnership, many of the cities here. The Minnesota Initiative Foundations have been working on this for a decade, collaborating on this, advancing all of these things on the right, convening and research, grants and loans, training and advocacy. And so I am grateful for that, and I acknowledge my amateur status. But what I wanted to do is try to add a complementary view to the community view, and that is the question of what have employers done in this space of child care in terms of making it an employee benefit in the past, what are they doing today, what could employers do into the future. So that's my thanks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on our child care challenges. I know you've been talking about this even as much as yesterday, and I think we all know the challenge. We lack capacity, we lack reliability, we lack a career track with living wage and full benefits. We lack a lot in this area. It's an underdeveloped market. It's an immature market in the United States and including in Greater Minnesota. But there is a business case, there's an economic case for businesses and employers to engage. And if you look back in time, the big Fortune 500 companies, 3 to 5% of them are investing in child care as an employee benefit in the same way, in similar ways, as they do for health plans and health insurance or retirement or paid time off. And they're doing that because there's a business case. They can attract team members in this war for talent. We find lower absenteeism, lower presenteeism, and higher productivity and higher retention when employers are progressive with their benefits set in general, with an environment of well-being more broadly, and including on health care. And on the right side, the community case for child care is clear as well. The child first and their well-being. There is an equity dimension to this for women as well as for people of color to get access to child care, to facilitate employment and progress. It's the health of the family, and it's attracting talent to the region and retaining talent in the region. So I think I'm singing to the choir. Next slide. Back to economies of scale and back to our 4 principles and trying to apply them to child care. I think, like other products and services, child care would have economic levels of scale. I don't know exactly what they are. I put up here maybe 30 to 50 to 70 seats to operate at sustainable unit costs over time. Maybe 20 is economic. Some are at 100 or 150. But I'm trying to make the general point that employers should think about the scale of child care capacity. Next slide. In terms of scope, most single employers in Greater Minnesota would have a workforce that's too small to sustain a child care center on their own. Only a few, maybe a few dozen, might have a workforce large enough and an implied child age population large enough to sustain it on its own. But if we think about scope and collaborating and aggregating the demand of multiple employers, we can imagine getting to an economic scale through that collaboration and justifying 30 to 50 to 70 seats in regions of different sizes. In terms of sustainability, in terms of planning for innovation, planning for investment, planning for product and service development, moving child care towards educational content and curriculum, the long-term view of continuous investment for sustainability in the space. There are several national providers that we've been studying that have some They certainly have some advantages, and that have some lessons that we might draw out of them and learn from them. These three, the top three, they've been innovating in childcare for decades, but they operate almost exclusively in major metro areas. So if we look at Minnesota, on the left is KinderCare, in the middle is Learning Care Group, on the right is Bright Horizons. These are, I think, the largest childcare providers in the country. If you look at the dots, those are their centers. And you can see they're largely in the Twin Cities. Rochester, Mayo, IBM, and others might have catalyzed some investment and might have attracted one of these providers to serve that region. But that, to date, is more of an exception. So these providers are operating at a very high scale, 1,000 centers or more each. They're operating at a very broad scope all across, likely 50 states. They're sustaining, they're innovating, they're attracting parents, they're attracting employers, and they are moving with velocity. They're building 50 a year, something like that. So as we look to this fourth dimension, this fourth economic principle for Greater Minnesota, just the rhetorical question, in which Greater Minnesota regions, in which cities or regional centers, might there be enough willing employers? There has to be a philosophy and a willingness to invest in this, invest the corporation's cash for workers and their children. Enough willing employers with enough aggregate demand to catalyze fund and sustain a child care center of the right size, for that coalition of employers and for that region. And here, the broader question is, do we have enough information? Do we know the answer to that question? I'll tell you, inside of Granite Partners, for our 10 companies, I don't know the answer to that question, but we want to know the answer to that question. So we're about studying our workforce, our child age children. And Eric, let's go one more slide ahead here and I'll come back to that. So, maybe back one. Yeah. Forward. One more. Right here. I think this is the question that we're trying to ask ourselves, and I think it'd be useful to ask dozens of employers, hundreds of employers, across Greater Minnesota. How many child care seats or slots are you, employer, corporation? Employer. Cities and counties are employers. Hospitals and clinics are employers. Schools, colleges, universities are employers, and yes, for-profit businesses, foundations, and nonprofits are employers. So how many child care seats are you, the employer, willing to commit to? Commit isn't even a strong enough word. How many are you willing to guarantee? And I'll talk about that word for 5 years, not less than 5 years, for 5 years, to serve your workforce in this city and region, likely in collaboration with other employers. And so as we think about each of those, a guarantee is scary. It's a risk of cash and an investment. But it really has to be a guarantee. There has to be guaranteed tenants to build a commercial office building, 80% or so. There has to be enough guaranteed demand for a child care of significant investment and size. Probably something like 80% or so of the capacity needs to be guaranteed for equity capital to invest, for debt to follow that investment, for governance and management to be built. So the guarantee to the corporation would be something like this. If we have a workforce of 100 people, there might be 10 children that are child care age. That's a reasonable estimate. Some of those children and families are going to choose in-home and family care. That's best for them. It'll always be an option. It'll always be preferred by some families. Let's call that 5 of them. Maybe the other 5 are looking for a high quality, sustainable and affordable child care center. The employer could guarantee 5 spots in this coalition, the risk they would be taking is that those 5 employees may or may not choose or stay with that particular care center, so they have to talk with those employees and do an internal survey before they make their guaranteed estimate. But if one of those families, if they only ended up filling 3 seats, and those families were paying for those seats with some assistance, which I'll talk about, and if they were only, had tuition for 3, the employer would pay the other 2 seats every year for 5 years. And with a very optimistic view of the price of childcare, if it were $10,000 a year, they would pay $20,000 in year 1 all the way through year 5 to guarantee the seat that wasn't filled and that wasn't partially paid for by the family. That's the guarantee. Granite is willing to make that guarantee. I think there are other employers who are willing to make that guarantee. It has to be for the right size in any particular company, in any particular region, and it requires additional information. The other important dimension is that every employer can and should choose their own tuition assistance. So if it's $10,000, some employers might choose 10% tuition assistance for the family. That's a $1,000 contribution towards the $10,000. Some will choose 50%. That will really attract families. It's an important economic advantage. A few, not many, might choose 100%. But the national providers, by way of benchmark, also provide, when they manage a service, a 10% discount on market rates. So if an employer were providing 10% tuition assistance, and if collectively there was enough scale for the provider to provide a 10% discount off of market rates, there's a 20% discount for the family. That's the hard question. We're going to be asking it of ourselves. This is the answer we'll get for ourselves on the next slide. We'll have a map. We are operating in 12 cities and regions across Minnesota. We'll know how many seats we might be willing to guarantee in each of those cities and each of those regions. This is the missing information in the marketplace, I think, that's preventing it from attracting private capital and the demand that is latent. So the next, back 1, 2, there we go. This is the thought. We're going to be surveying our companies, the CEOs, the HR professionals, and their workforce. And we have a market research firm that does this for us. We have, we can do that at low cost. And it wouldn't cost really any more to open this survey, it's web-based, to employers in Fergus Falls, in Alexandria, in St. Cloud, who we are not affiliated with, to also complete this survey to see how much demand they have and how much they're willing to guarantee. Then that map could be, more of a multi-employer view of demand by region. And now on to this community partners slide. So if there were to be interest in other employers participating, the community partners in this room would be essential colleagues to help share this information, share the survey, encourage reflection, encourage participation, talk with them one-on-one. Jennifer, I put the Minnesota Chamber on here, the Minnesota Initiative Foundation's on here, the economic development organizations, the utilities, the businesses, the cities, the counties. This kind of collaboration only happens through trusted relationships in geography. And it is also, I think, what prevents us from knowing what the true demand is in a particular geography. So this is an open invitation, and if anyone has interest, I appreciate if you would share it with Scott, with Kelly, with others. On to the illustrative roadmap, and this is how we're thinking of it. We need to know demand inside of our 10 companies, 2,500 employees. will understand that, will know aggregate demand. For us, like for all of you, it is across several, 10 or 12 cities and regions. The way we would go about this is not to manage it ourselves. We are not experts at child care. We can't be experts even 10 years from now. It's a deep learning and experience base that you have to have volume at over many years to innovate and sustain and provide really a high quality service. So we would select a management partner. We would conduct a request for proposal. It would include the 3 big national players. We would learn from them. One of them might be the best partner for us. It could also include other regional players in the state of Minnesota who we might not know to help manage for us, maybe to help manage for many employers. But we know we need management, governance, regulation, information technology, employee benefits. We need an infrastructure for this that would take decades to build. And so that's how we would go about it. We would likely set up a corporation. You know, we might have some excess space in some of our companies that could be retrofitted for childcare, but likely there would be some new buildings or some purchased or new buildings built. Finally, I'll close on this note, and this is from my home region, and a wonderful development in our region in building the Ledge Amphitheater, which is now operating in Wade Park. It's a wonderful example of collaboration and work across sectors to build this beautiful facility that's bringing in some great concerts, great names, adding to culture and entertainment in our region. And I don't know the full history. There are, I think, some people in the room who do, but this really was led by officials in the city of Wade Park and over some years. And private sector collaborated in, social sector, nonprofits and foundations collaborated in, and now it's serving the entirety of the community. But it's a great example of collaboration across those sectors, and it's my belief that in the world we live in, which with such scarce resources and budget demands, that collaboration is part of the secret sauce to getting things done. And that it's in some cases the only way to get things done, to bring enough resources and know-how together. I have gone on way too long, and I appreciate the invitation here. I'll close by saying I hope one thing that I said might be useful to you and to your organization. I don't know if we have time for questions or comments or skepticism.
We can take a few here, Rick. So.
Hi, thank you. I think it was a very interesting model, and I thank you for presenting it. One of the questions I have is, it seems in your model, based on kind of looking at employer aggregate demand, even excluding large public sector and private sector and nonprofit employers, you're missing a lot of the workforce. And what, the gig community, obviously we see a lot of people changing in how they work. You're missing a lot of small businesses. You're missing a lot of people at the margins.
Yeah.
And so how do you address getting child care to those people?
Great question. I would say that it's not an either or. That employers have a special ability, a resource base, a responsibility to catalyze in a way that small businesses cannot, in a way that independent consultants or workforce cannot. So we start with where resources are and we move them, and then think about the equity design along the way. So in an 80-20 model, if you have to rent 80% of an apartment before you build, for example, the 80% helps get it built, but there's still 20%. And/or you could overbuild so that it really could be a community center. And to overbuild, you have to have people who want to take risk together and sustain losses together. There will be losses in year 1, year 2, likely year 3, maybe not break even in year 4. So I think it's a very good design question, and likely the best model for this is a cooperative, a co-op. It's not a for-profit company. It's not for a few shareholders to gain on. It's a service provided to a group of members, a group of patrons who value the service. The employers could be the patrons, and you know, progressive employers should want to solve for the entirety of the citizens, the entirety of the workforce, and the co-op model would signal that from the beginning. The cash you invest, and by the way, employers not only have to guarantee seats, some of them, not all of them, some of them have to invest cash equity in the initiative, in the co-op up front. Otherwise it doesn't catalyze, it doesn't attract the debt capital. So hopefully that helps address the question, and it's an important one.